When Stanley arrived at the rescue sanctuary, he was all gangly legs, boundless enthusiasm, and overwhelming friendliness packed into a large, goofy frame. Likely some sort of hound mix with maybe a dash of Great Dane thrown in for good measure. He loved everyone and everything with indiscriminate joy. People, other dogs, squeaky toys, interesting smells, the possibility of treats. His tail didn't just wag. It conducted symphonies of happiness, often threatening to knock over anything within a 3-foot radius. Found as a stray, but clearly having known kindness somewhere in his past. Stanley's only real issue was his sheer, unadulterated exuberance, which could be a bit much for quieter animals or unsuspecting humans. He settled quickly into the routine of the sanctuary, run by the ever-patient Liam Kincaid. Stanley adored the playtime in the large, fenced fields, romping with the other rescued dogs, his long legs eating up the ground in joyful leaps. He soaked up attention from volunteers like a furry sponge. But Liam noticed Stanley seemed to crave a deeper, more constant connection, often found lingering near the door to the main house or peering hopefully into the cattery section, a separate, securely enclosed area attached to the barn. Enter Mavis. Mavis was everything Stanley was not. She was a small, perpetually unimpressed tabby cat with narrowed eyes, flattened ears that signaled imminent displeasure, and a low, guttural hiss that served as her primary form of communication. Rescued from a hoarding situation where dozens of cats lived in squalor, Mavis viewed the world, and particularly other living creatures, with deep suspicion and profound irritation. She tolerated Liam's presence because he provided food and clean bedding. But affection was met with swift rejection, often involving unsheathed claws. She spent most of her days perched high on a shelf in the cattery's main room, surveying her domain like a tiny, furry despot, silently judging all who dared enter. She certainly had no time or inclination for dogs, whom she viewed as loud, clumsy, and offensively cheerful. Liam kept the dogs and cats strictly separated for obvious safety reasons. The cattery had its own outdoor catio, securely fenced, while the dogs had their fields. The only overlap was the main barn aisle, which Liam sometimes used to transfer animals, always ensuring one species was safely contained before the other was moved. It was during one such transfer that the unlikely friendship began. Liam was carrying Mavis in a secure carrier back from a vet check. As he walked down the barn aisle, Stanley happened to be waiting patiently by the door to the dog runs, hoping for early playtime. Stanley, ever curious, spotted the carrier. His tail started its enthusiastic thumping against the wall. He winced softly, head cocked, sniffing the air. Inside the carrier, Mavis reacted predictably. A low, ominous growl rumbled from her chest, followed by a series of sharp, angry hisses directed at the blurry, annoying shape outside her prison. Most dogs would have backed off, perhaps barked back, or simply lost interest. But Stanley was Stanley. He seemed utterly unfazed by the hostile reception. He wagged his tail harder, dropped into a hopeful play bow right there in the aisle, and let out a soft, friendly woof, as if inviting the furious furball to join him. Liam chuckled, despite himself. "She's not interested, Stan," he said, continuing towards the cattery. But Stanley watched them go, a look of intense, friendly curiosity on his face. From that day on, Stanley seemed fascinated by the cattery. Whenever possible, he'd linger near its entrance, sniffing intently at the bottom of the door, occasionally letting out a soft whine or a hopeful bark. Mavis, if she happened to be near the door on her side, would invariably reply with a volley of hisses. It became a strange, daily ritual. Stanley's optimistic overtures met with Mavis's furious rejections. Liam began to notice something else. Mavis, usually glued to her highest perch, started spending more time on a lower shelf near the cattery door, often peering out through the reinforced screen window into the barn aisle, especially when Stanley was nearby. Her posture remained stiff, her ears perpetually flattened, but she was watching him. The turning point came during a particularly cold snap when Liam brought some of the more vulnerable animals, including Mavis, into the heated main room of his small farmhouse adjacent to the barn. Stanley, being well-behaved indoors, despite his size, was also allowed inside, confined to a dog bed across the room. Mavis, perched atop a cat tree Liam had set up for her, watched Stanley with her usual suspicion. Stanley, for his part, seemed overjoyed just to be sharing the same indoor space. He lay on his bed, occasionally thumping his tail, but mostly just watching Mavis with a soft, adoring expression. He didn't approach her. He seemed to understand the invisible boundary. One evening, Liam dozed off in his armchair. He woke sometime later to a strange sight. Mavis had cautiously descended from her perch. Slowly, deliberately, she padded across the room, her movements betraying none of her usual bristling hostility. Stanley watched her approach, his tail giving only the slightest, most tentative thump, as if sensing the fragility of the moment. Mavis stopped a foot away from Stanley's bed. They looked at each other for a long moment, the enormous, goofy dog and the tiny, grumpy cat. Then Mavis did something utterly unexpected. She let out a soft, almost questioning mew, a sound Liam had rarely heard from her. Stanley responded with a soft, breathy sigh. Mavis then proceeded to curl up, not on Stanley's bed, but right beside it, pointedly facing away from him, but undeniably near him. Stanley closed his eyes, resting his great head on his paws, seemingly content with this proximity. Liam watched, barely breathing, utterly astonished. From that night on, the dynamic shifted. Mavis still hissed occasionally, still maintained her air of perpetual annoyance towards the world at large, but her hostility towards Stanley evaporated. When they were occasionally in the same supervised indoor space, she tolerated his presence, sometimes even choosing to nap near him. Stanley, in turn, seemed to understand her need for space, tempering his usual boisterousness around her, approaching her with a gentleness that was touching to witness. Their bond deepened in subtle ways. If Stanley was outside embarked, Mavis would often go to the window, watching. If Mavis let out a particularly aggrieved yowl from the cattery, Stanley would whine softly at the door. They seemed attuned to each other, an invisible thread connecting the perpetually optimistic dog and the profoundly pessimistic cat. The true test came when Liam decided Mavis, despite her grumpy demeanor, might actually benefit from a carefully managed adoption into a quiet, cat-savvy home. He posted her profile online, highlighting her need for patience and understanding. A potential adopter, an elderly woman named Clara, who had experience with difficult cats, expressed interest. When Clara came to meet Mavis, Liam brought the cat into the main meeting room. Mavis was predictably tense, hiding under a chair. Stanley happened to be outside the window, peering in. Seeing Mavis distressed, Stanley let out a low, worried whine. Hearing him, Mavis poked her head out from under the chair, looked towards the window, and let out that soft, questioning mew again. Clara watched this interaction, fascinated. "They know each other?" she asked. Liam explained the unlikely friendship. Clara was charmed. She spent time with Mavis, patiently letting the cat dictate the terms of their interaction. But she also spent time talking to Stanley through the window, admiring his gentle nature. In the end, Clara made a decision that surprised everyone, including Liam. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that Mavis needs her friend. They seem to have a connection. Would you? Would you ever consider adopting them out together?" Liam was stunned. Adopting a large, energetic dog and a grumpy, difficult cat together? It was highly unconventional. But looking at Stanley's hopeful face pressed against the glass and Mavis actually sitting calmly near Clara, seemingly reassured by Stanley's presence nearby, he couldn't dismiss it. After careful consideration, multiple supervised interactions, and long conversations about managing their unique dynamic, Clara adopted both Stanley and Mavis. The transition had its bumps, of course. Mavis initially claimed the highest bookshelf as her own, descending only for food and swift glares at Stanley. Stanley learned quickly which furniture was off-limits and perfected the art of occupying floor space without encroaching on Mavis's perceived territory.